Have you ever wondered why a man can look perfectly composed on the outside while inside he's haunted by a silence he cannot name? The kind of silence that doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't explain. It simply withdraws, like a tide that once touched the shore and then disappeared, leaving behind only traces of what used to be warmth. To most men, this silence feels like death, not because she's gone, but because something in him has been forced to awaken. Her silence becomes the mirror he cannot escape, reflecting every wound he's tried to bury under control, power, and pride. In the realm of the psyche, silence is not the absence of communication, it is a language of its own. Jung once said that what we do not bring to consciousness returns as fate. Her silence then becomes his fate, the unspoken echo of every truth he refused to see. It's not her withdrawal that breaks him, but the confrontation with the void she leaves behind, a void that demands he look within. Because when the feminine stops explaining herself, the masculine loses his script. The dynamic shifts. The one who used to dominate the emotional landscape suddenly stands in the ruins of his own ego, wondering how something so quiet could dismantle him so completely. Most men aren't prepared for a woman's silence. They crave her reaction because it confirms their existence. Her tears validate his importance. Her arguments reassure him that he still matters. But when she chooses quiet, not as a weapon, but as liberation, he faces an unfamiliar mirror. In that stillness, he hears everything he never wanted to admit, the way he projected his insecurities onto her, the way he mistook control for love, and the way he depended on her emotional labor to feel powerful. Her silence exposes the architecture of his own emotional immaturity. And yet, she doesn't do it to punish him. She does it because she has awakened to something sacred. She understands that explaining herself to someone committed to misunderstanding her is an act of self-abandonment. She realizes that begging for emotional reciprocity from a man still trapped in his shadow is to bleed for someone who hasn't yet met his own soul. This silence is her rebirth, the moment she stops chasing validation and starts embodying truth. He, however, feels her withdrawal like a phantom limb. His ego tells him he's fine, that he's moved on, but the unconscious whispers otherwise. Every time he sees another woman laugh the way she did, something stirs. Every time he lies in the quiet, his mind drifts back to her absence. Because her silence wasn't rejection, it was a reflection. It showed him how loud his inner emptiness had become. To the unhealed masculine, silence feels like punishment. But to the awakened feminine, it is prayer. She no longer needs to defend her worth because she understands it now, not as a concept, but as an embodiment. She has entered the sacred temple of self-respect, where explanations are unnecessary and energy speaks louder than words. This shift confuses him. How can someone so nurturing suddenly become so untouchable? He forgets that the same depth that once nourished him is the same depth that can drown him when misused. In Jungian terms, he has met his anima, the feminine within him, through her presence. And now, through her silence, he must meet his shadow. Every unresolved part of him that sought control, validation, or emotional dominance rises to the surface. But instead of seeing this as an invitation to grow, he resists. The ego hates mirrors. It hates stillness. It thrives in noise, in pursuit, in conquest. But her silence offers none of that, only reflection. And reflection requires humility, something few men are ready for until life breaks them open. If you've ever been that woman, the one who went quiet, not from weakness but from strength, you know this truth intimately. You learned that words can't reach those who choose deafness. You realize that silence, though lonely at first, becomes your sanctuary. It's where your intuition becomes louder than your pain. It's where you begin to understand that you were never asking for too much, you were simply asking the wrong person. His denial is his shield. He'll never admit what your silence did to him, because to do so would mean acknowledging that he lost something deeper than love. He lost access to the part of himself that only your energy could awaken. And yet, life has a strange way of making us face what we resist. Sooner or later, he'll meet another woman who mirrors that same silence. And in her stillness, he'll feel it again, that ache, that unexplainable recognition that something precious slipped through his fingers, not because you stopped loving him, but because you started loving yourself. Silence is a mirror that does not flatter. It strips away illusion, ego, and the comfort of distraction. When she withdrew into her stillness, he felt it as an exile from warmth, not realizing that what he truly missed was not her voice, but the reflection of himself he found in her attention. Her silence dismantled the performance he had been rehearsing for years, the role of the strong one, the unshakable, the one who didn't need. But in truth, he needed her reactions to sustain his own narrative. Without her emotional feedback, he faced the unbearable, the hollow architecture of his own self-image. To the awakened feminine, this moment of withdrawal is not revenge, it is reclamation. It is the point where her compassion no longer leaks through her boundaries, where she realizes that empathy without discernment becomes self-destruction. Jung taught that we are possessed by what we do not understand, and her silence breaks the spell. It frees her from the possession of needing to fix, explain, or be understood. She becomes the observer rather than the savior. And in that detachment, she ascends from the emotional battlefield where she once fought for crumbs of reciprocity. He, meanwhile, encounters the unfamiliar terrain of solitude. Not the external kind, but the internal, the kind that confronts a man with his own unlived emotions. He begins to notice the emptiness between messages left unanswered, the nights that feel longer than they should, the laughter that rings hollow when she is not there to witness it. This is the moment the masculine psyche begins to unravel. Because what once seemed like her weakness, her emotion, her depth, her sensitivity, now reveals itself as the very essence of what held him together. Still, he cannot admit this. To do so would shatter the illusion of control that his ego depends on. So he tells himself she was too much, too emotional, too demanding. Yet beneath the surface, something in him whispers that perhaps she was simply more awake than he could handle. The truth he resists is simple. A conscious woman will always unsettle an unconscious man. She does not flatter his wounds, she exposes them. And when she stops trying to heal him, he mistakes her detachment for cruelty, not realizing it is mercy, the mercy of allowing him to finally meet himself. Her silence, in essence, becomes his initiation. It is the dark night of the masculine soul, the descent into the underworld of his own repressed feelings. He may distract himself with other faces, other bodies, but none of them carry the same gravity. Because what he truly misses is not her presence, but the mirror she held. The woman he thought he wanted back was never external. She was the reflection of the feminine within him, the part he abandoned long ago in pursuit of strength without vulnerability. And yet, something stirs within him as he wrestles with this absence. The quiet begins to teach him what noise never could. He starts to sense that her silence is not emptiness but invitation, a call to descend, to question, to feel. Slowly, he begins to see that his patterns of domination, withdrawal, or emotional avoidance were not power, but fear disguised as masculinity. He begins to understand what Seneca meant when he said, "He who is brave is free." True freedom does not come from control, but from surrender, from facing what one fears most, the inner truth. In her absence, he learns to sit with discomfort. At first, it feels unbearable. The silence she left behind becomes deafening, echoing through every distraction. But eventually, that silence becomes a teacher. It strips him of performance, of pretense, of pride. He learns to listen, not to her, but to himself. And when he begins to listen, he hears the faint voice of the anima, the inner feminine, calling him toward wholeness. It is a voice that asks not for conquest, but for connection, not for explanation, but for presence. You see, Her silence was never meant to punish him. It was meant to awaken him. It was the universe's way of saying, what you refuse to honor will leave you, so that you may learn to honor it within yourself. That is the alchemy of separation. It transforms attachment into awareness. It turns longing into lesson. For her, it marks the end of needing to be understood. For him, it marks the beginning of understanding. And so, as she walks in peace, he begins to unravel in silence. He'll replay memories, not out of nostalgia, but out of longing for the sense of self that existed in her reflection. What he doesn't yet realize is that her silence did not take anything from him. It revealed what was missing all along. There comes a moment when the silence becomes unbearable, not because it screams, but because it whispers truths too heavy to ignore. For him, this moment arrives like a slow burn, an ache that no distraction can numb. The masculine ego, once inflated with certainty and pride, begins to collapse under the weight of what it denied. He starts to realize that her absence was not merely physical, it was spiritual. Something in him has dimmed, and he cannot name what it is. Her silence, like an invisible force, strips away his illusions one by one, leaving him face to face with the self he has long abandoned. The unhealed man often confuses dominance with security. He mistakes control for love, validation for connection, and attention for intimacy. But when she withdrew, quietly, without drama, without explanation, he lost the mirror that reflected his false power. For the first time, he had to confront the emptiness he carried beneath the surface of his confidence. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Her silence, therefore, becomes the ultimate irritation, because it demands introspection instead of reaction. At first, he resists. He runs. He seeks distractions, new faces, shallow conversations, temporary validation. Yet, beneath every fleeting pleasure, there is an echo of something sacred that he can't replace. Her energy lingers, not as possession, but as lesson. Every woman who follows seems to lack that same intangible depth, the gravitational stillness that once grounded him. What he called complicated was, in truth, divine. Her silence now teaches him this in the hardest possible way, through absence. The feminine, when conscious, holds a power that words cannot describe. It is not loud, not aggressive, not performative. It is presence, a frequency that draws the masculine out of his head and into his heart. When she withdrew that energy, the structure of his emotional world collapsed. He is forced to feel the rawness of his own disconnectedness. For the first time, he senses the fragility of the walls he built. He begins to understand that his avoidance of vulnerability was not strength but fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being known, fear of surrendering to something greater than his control. In her quiet, she rises. What once was emotional turmoil has become sacred clarity. She sees that she was never meant to be the emotional caretaker of his wounds. Her silence becomes a boundary, a temple built from wisdom and restraint. She no longer tries to rescue the man drowning in his own ego. She knows that doing so would only drown her too. She walks away, not with bitterness, but with reverence, for herself, for her growth, and even for him, who unknowingly became her greatest teacher. Her transformation unnerves him. There is something profoundly unsettling about a woman who no longer reacts. Her peace becomes provocative. Her stillness feels like rejection, but it is simply transcendence. He begins to realize that she has stepped into a different frequency, one where love is not bargaining, where attention is not currency, and where silence is not punishment but power. This realization humbles him. It begins the slow dismantling of the false masculine, the one built on pride, control, and fear of loss. He starts to remember the moments when she tried to reach him, when her voice trembled not with anger but with longing to be met halfway. He ignored it then, dismissing her sensitivity as weakness. Now he sees that what he called emotional was, in truth, intuitive, a depth he could not comprehend at the time. And so, her silence becomes his final teacher. It doesn't come with explanations or closure. It comes with reflection. It is not her responsibility to guide him anymore. The lesson has already been delivered, in the language of withdrawal. For the conscious woman, silence is not the end. It is the beginning of her sovereignty. It marks the moment she reclaims her energy from the altar of external validation and places it back into her own hands. She learns that love does not require self-sacrifice, and that peace is not found in being understood, but in understanding herself. She becomes the embodiment of stoic grace, calm in presence, firm in boundary, radiant in self-worth. And yet for him, the silence continues to echo. It follows him into his dreams, his routines, his quiet moments. It becomes the background hum of his conscience, the whisper of the anima calling from the depths of his psyche. Integrate me. Feel. Awaken. Whether he listens or not will determine the man he becomes. Because her silence was never the end of love, it was the invitation to evolution. There comes a day when he finally understands. It doesn't arrive with lightning or revelation, but with quiet acceptance, the same kind of stillness she once embodied. He begins to see her silence not as abandonment, but as grace. What once felt like rejection now reveals itself as redirection, an invitation to confront the parts of himself he had long buried beneath arrogance and distraction. Her absence taught him the one truth his ego resisted most, that love is not control, and power is not presence. In Jungian language, he has descended into the underworld of his own psyche, the shadow realm where truth strips him bare. Every defense, every mask, every illusion of superiority dissolves under the weight of honesty. He sees that his need to dominate was born from fear of vulnerability, that his avoidance of emotion was a wall built against his own fragility. Her silence became the alchemical fire that burned away the false gold of pride, revealing the raw metal of self-awareness beneath. For her, this same silence has become a sanctuary. She no longer waits for him to awaken or to understand. She no longer performs worthiness in the hope of being chosen. She knows now that her stillness was never about him, it was about her rebirth. It was the moment she decided to choose herself, even if it meant being misunderstood. In the absence of his validation, she found something far more enduring, self-respect. In the space where his voice used to echo, she began to hear her own. There is a certain kind of woman who learns to love from a place beyond attachment. Her love is no longer a currency of exchange, it becomes a state of being. She gives, not to prove her value, but because her soul overflows. And when she walks away, she does so with quiet reverence, not because she stopped caring, but because she finally realized that caring does not require suffering. She becomes the embodiment of the divine feminine that Jung described, intuitive, magnetic, self-possessed. A force that does not chase, but attracts by simply existing in truth. For him, the journey continues. Some men awaken when faced with silence, others resist it until life repeats the lesson. But either way, her absence becomes the axis around which his transformation turns. He learns slowly that to love a conscious woman is to face the mirror she holds without flinching. To be seen fully, not as hero or savior, but as human. It is to surrender pride in favor of presence, to exchange control for connection. Only then does he begin to understand what she was teaching him all along, that love without awareness is possession, and desire without humility is destruction. In time he may thank her, not with words, but with growth. He may never admit what her silence did to him, but his life will show it. The way he listens differently now. The way he pauses before reacting. The way he treats the next woman not as an extension of his ego, but as a reflection of his soul. This is the quiet revolution her silence began, the transformation of man through the mirror of the feminine. And she, standing on the other side of it all, no longer seeks closure. She no longer needs to know whether he understood. Because understanding is not her task. Peace is. She walks forward with the serenity of one who has faced her own darkness and learned to dance within it. Her silence, once mistaken for surrender, was her initiation into power. It was her descent and her resurrection. In the end, it is not she who was forgotten, it was he who was changed. Her silence carved the path to his awakening and her freedom alike. And in that paradox lies the eternal dance between the masculine and the feminine, the giver and the mirror, the seeker and the mystery. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.